I was in a bit of a dilemma, I have to say, when I got asked about speaking here. I wasn't sure whether I should talk about how to make an app, or whether in fact I would be better to talk about how not to make an app. Because in fact, I think we might know more about this than about the previous. So rather than getting into any of these particularly tricky territories, since it was a children's event, I thought that I would best just tell you a story. It is, I must assure you, a story with a moral. It's called The Publisher, the App, and His Budget. And it starts off, one night a prosperous publisher was dreaming about some of his wonderful content, as publishers do, and he suddenly woke up with just the most amazing idea for an app. After a hasty breakfast, he rushed off to his office, found his favourite producer, and told her all about his wonderful idea. Then he fished around in his pocket, and he handed her a juicy budget before sending her on her way. The producer decided that this wonderful app really had to look amazing, and so she set off to find herself the very best designer. After trudging along many, many corridors, she finally found her perfect designer. He boasted of having designed 101 websites. And besides, he had a trendy beard, and he looked kind of cool, even if he was a bit expensive. Together, they whiled away many a happy hour laboriously writing up the spec, storyboarding and wireframing every last detail of the app. Meantime, the budget quietly trickled away in the background. At last they proudly showed it to the publisher. Truly the hard work was nearly done, and just as well, because the budget was now a mere third of its original size. But the publisher had just returned from the faraway land of dust or magic, where he'd learned many a wonderful thing about making apps. "We must have some video in it," he demanded. The producer sat down and sobbed as she thought of changing her precious spec. And besides, who would make the video? She bawled when she thought of the budget. But then she remembered her friend Wendy, who does the odd wedding video in her spare time. Yeah, she would do. Cheered up a bit, she reassured herself. Only the programming left to be done. As she walked down the steps to the dungeon where the software developers were kept. After picking a particularly weedy-looking specimen, she heaved the spec into his cell and checked that he had enough juice, junk food and fizzy drinks to last for several weeks. As she left, she shouted out, "Remember what the last developer who dared to show initiative and departed from the spec," she reminded him, before leaving him to get on with it. Many weeks went by, and the budget became just a faded memory. Threats and beatings just seemed to slow the programmer down even more as he mumbled dark incantations about APIs and bugs and profiling. Finally, one day, the exasperated publisher declared that he would wait no longer. "It must ship by sundown," he decreed. And so the app came to be published. Tears rolled down the producer's face as she sadly compared the miserable app with her wonderful spec. The end. Okay, so I exaggerate a little bit there, but really this isn't that unfamiliar a tale. And like every good children's story, it has a moral. App design and development very often tends to be shoehorned into traditional publishing and software development processes. Creativity is often squeezed out, apps are released without polish, budgets are blown, Often skilled and dedicated people are involved, but they're often siloed. They do their work in isolation. A few other points to note. First of all, this app was publisher driven. It came from a publisher's idea. It didn't really take into account the audience or the market. It was designed on paper. No prototyping, no user testing, no concept of showing the ideas to somebody, to the audience at an early stage. No teamwork. And finally, worst thing of all, and it's good enough, let's get it out the door mentality. The budget is run out, schedule is run out, it must be time to ship the app. So what is Appcraft? How do you do this properly? Well, the first thing to say is, I'm not really sure, but I'm having a really good time over the past few years trying to find the answer to this question. And I think I might have some insights that we've learned as a team at TouchPress. The first thing to remember is, if you have a craft, then you must have a medium. A potter crafts in clay, a writer crafts in words. An app developer crafts a particularly interesting, new and exciting creative medium, and we need to see it as a creative medium. Let me explain. Interactive multimedia, touchscreens have been around a long time. I should know, I was playing around with these in the 90s and making CD-ROMs, making DVD-ROMs. And they were good for their time. Children enjoyed them. We got satisfaction out of making them. But fundamentally, there was a problem. And the fundamental problem was they depended on hardware that was sluggish. They depended on low-resolution screens, unsuitable, clunky operating systems, discs that got scratched and lost. It just really didn't really work. It was unsatisfactory. Contrast today. And by today, I actually mean the last 12 months. It's really only in the last 12 months that we have these amazing devices that support very powerful graphics processing, vibrant, high-resolution color displays, displays that are actually high-resolution enough for our eyes to appreciate. Instantly responsive multi-touch screens, no lag, instant animation, high-speed solid-state drives, always-on connectivity, motion sensors, all sorts of sensors, and all in a compact form. And this is an exciting medium to work with. And what we need to realize is that what we do on these devices isn't television, it isn't a book, it isn't the web. In fact, it's its own unique thing on this medium, and it's the app. And we shouldn't be confusing it with anything that came before. It's a new medium. Just to give you an idea of what's possible, I'm going to show you on the screen here one of our apps. This is our most popular children's app, and it's some of you will have seen this, it's a 3D atlas of the globe, the world, and you can spin it around. I'm not going to walk you through this app, I just want you to notice a couple of things. Okay? Notice the motion there. Watch my finger. Okay? It follows me. And there's no lag. It's instantaneous. Okay? We released this app first on the iPad 1. And there was a lag. It was unsatisfactory. We were unhappy. We couldn't make this app the way we wanted to make this app. If you pinch in and zoom, okay, scroll around, the motion is absolutely smooth. Kids love this because it's tactile, because they can almost feel the motion. I've watched 2-year-olds playing with this app. Okay, they're totally immersed in what they're seeing. There is no technological barrier between them and the app itself. That's completely opaque, it's invisible. But Not only has the technology caught up with the ambition, but we also have become more sophisticated about the way in which we use these devices. We depend on these devices no matter where we are and whatever we're doing. In fact, you could almost call it co-evolution. We're evolving along with this technology. It's no accident that in 2013, last year, the whole concept of skeuomorphism is something that we turned our back on. We no longer need a calendar app that looks like a leather-bound diary to understand what the calendar app does. So that look is gone. Okay? Apple took quite a bold step forward and helped the whole industry to move forward in the way in which we think. We don't need to create a book app that looks like a book, because we now know what an app should be like. The comfort of the physical analogy isn't required anymore. We and the app are fast becoming one. Well, that's slightly exaggerating it. But look at this. Look at the wee kid with the Google Glass on. This is only the beginning of the app revolution. That's what we need to realize. What we're now working with on these tablets is really only the beginning of the class of devices that apps are going to be running on. So we need to think about an app as a much broader thing than just running on an iPhone or an iPad or an Android tablet. Okay? Apps will be running on corneal implants in time. They'll be running on our walls, they'll be running on our tables, they'll be running in our cars. In fact, we even take these devices to bed. But before you can work with a medium, you really need to understand it. I happen to live in an old farmhouse. We've been doing it up for the last 25 or so years. And I recently had a woodworker help me to build a set of stairs. And it was a real joy, pleasure to watch him work, because he really understood his medium. He knew all about wood. He knew its properties. He knew how to use his tools. And Appcraft is really no different. We have to think of it in that way. It's about understanding the medium, and it's about understanding the tools and having the skills to work with those tools. At the end of the day, it's really digital craftsmanship. Let me explain what I mean. I'm about to show you a couple of photographs, okay? And I don't want you to overanalyze this. I just want you to look at the photographs and think about what they tell you about the medium itself. Photograph number 1. What these tell us is very simple. These are intimate, personal experiences. The way in which we interact with these devices is very different than the way in which we interact with the TV, the way in which we interact with the radio, with books. Well, actually, books aren't that different. Books fall in the same category. Okay, we read books in bed. We read books everywhere we go. Okay, so that carries over. But the fact that they're intimate, personal, that the engagement is a very personal engagement, means that we need to think about that when we design and conceive of our apps. Okay, we need to think about the context within which they're going to be used. So it's a different sort of experience than browsing a website. It's a different sort of experience than listening, watching TV. It's an intimate experience. We need to bear that in mind in our design. One more picture. Could resist. It's also an original work. This is where a lot of apps fall down. Okay, apps are derivative works. Somebody says, oh, let's make an app out of this book. Or let's make an app for this movie. Nuh-uh. Apps should be conceived of as original works. Okay, the content may not be original, content may have been used before. What we're talking about here is not new content necessarily, but is reimagining how the user would engage with that content on these intimate personal devices, using this new medium and all the capabilities that it has. Okay, so you remember the Barefoot World Atlas app that I showed you just a second ago? This here was a book. It had pages, it had one page for every part of the world, and you could turn the pages. And we could very easily have taken that book and made an app which had one page for every part of the world, and you could turn the pages. That would have been the easy thing to do. But we knew this device was capable of more. We were capable of putting a completely different interface on this, and that's the approach that we took. So now we understand a bit more about the medium. Let's get back to asking our big question: what actually is Appcraft? And the first thing I have to say is it requires a creative team. Here's our creative team at TouchPress. This is the rub, this is the real issue actually, because these devices are complex and they require a multiplicity of disciplines. You need an interface designer, you need visual design, you need software engineers, game developers, 3D developers, video producers, audio producers, storytellers, writers, illustrators, animators, marketeers. And each of these people need to be working at the top of their game. This is both the beauty and the bugbear of app development. And many app publishers and developers simply fail to grasp this. They assume that just because they've published books before, or made television before, or published software before, that the same processes and skills will suffice with a few tweaks here and there. And if there isn't somebody to do it well, we can just get a freelancer in for a few days. Like the producer's friend who made wedding videos. And there isn't any point in just bringing all these people together. You've got to forge them into a creative team. And that's been one of the biggest challenges that we've had at TouchPress, is make all these talented people that we've hired work together as a creative team, play off each other's strengths. So let's focus on this team for a moment. Everybody on this team needs a great passion for the content and the audience. We don't want people on our team who couldn't care less about what they're working on. For example, we're working on an app at the moment which is a field guide for bird watchers. And we have many people on our team who knew nothing about birds, who knew nothing about bird watchers. And we've organised bird watching outings so that they can get a real feel for what it's like to be passionate about this subject. Some of them are actually becoming interested. We also have a standard interview question at TouchPress, which we ask everybody who joins the company. And it's an interesting question because people react immediately in two ways. And the question is, tell me about something that you're passionate about outside of your work. And the reaction is invariably a sudden panic because it wasn't what they expected. Or suddenly a smile drifts across their face and suddenly they can talk about something they're really excited about. Those are the people we want to hire. It doesn't really matter what it is. You've got to be passionate about something. You've got to understand what passion is. Creative teams appreciate and respect one another. They respect each other's skills. They understand each other's skills. They understand when they should step back and let somebody else do it. They also understand what's possible in the other person's domain or realm. And therefore they knock off each other. For example, in our Barefoot World Atlas, we had a designer who decided that every window shouldn't be a sharp rectangle. It should have all these wobbly edges because kids draw wobbly windows when you ask them to draw windows. And most engineers, me being an engineer, would throw up their hands in horror and say, well, windows just have straight edges, too bad. You know, that's it. But no, we have engineers who want to make windows with wobbly edges, even though that's tough. They want to make it possible. They want to fulfill somebody else on the team's creative vision. They take pride in it. In some of our music apps, we have the score following along with the music, and the musicians we were working with could pick up the fact that the score maybe was drifting a little bit or wasn't quite in sync. And as an engineer you could say, well, so what? Good enough? I can't see what's wrong. But no, we listened, and we listened very carefully until we could hear what was wrong too. And then we worked hard to make it absolutely right, so that even professional musicians could appreciate what was going on here. And we have editors who worry about things like M-dashes and smart apostrophes. You're all publishers, you probably know about these day by day. But we have software developers who never knew that such things existed, let alone cared. And we want those software engineers to be as fussy about this as the editor is. People need to appreciate what's important. Creative teams are challenged by the word impossible. Here's an example which I was just about to show you. So some of you may have heard of the app that we did with Disney, called Disney Animated. And it's all about the story of animation, how animated films and movies have been made over the years. And it led to a question, sort of an obvious question. Why couldn't we put every animated movie that Disney has ever made into this app? You can imagine the horror when that question was posed. Okay, there's only 2 gigabytes available for these apps. Even the device couldn't hold all those movies. How could we possibly do this? Okay. This is where creative thinking comes into play. This is where the team needs to sort of work on these ideas. It would have been very easy just to throw this out and say it's impossible. But instead, we came up with this concept.
I'm going to plug in your audio.
No. Yeah.
If you want it.
I don't really want it, but I don't really have it.
Here you go. I think that's kind of important.
So this is Disney Animated. I'll show you some of it later on, but the thing that I really want to draw your attention to is this. This is, in fact, every animated movie that Disney ever made. Okay? If you don't believe me, you can just put your finger on and you can swipe through them all. Every row is a movie, and as you swipe across it, you can watch that movie. And if you've seen it before, you'll find scenes that you recognize. All in one page. Okay?
I think it's very appropriate to clap at this point.
This is a really good example of one person in the team. I'll have to mention his name, Teo Gray, who had this idea. And he basically threw it out as a challenge to the engineering team, saying, you know, is this possible? And they said, well, it's only possible if you can process all those movies frame by frame. So we had to set up several Mac Pros running in parallel for about a week to process all the movies, to extract all this information. Then we had to write an algorithm to process the colors. Okay, it was a tough technical challenge. We really didn't know if we could actually do this. And yet, there it is. We actually got it to work. Another example, going back to Atlas here. We had released this initially in 3 languages. It was 1.7 gigabytes, which is quite big for an app, as you know. And we wanted to add an extra couple of languages to this. The problem was every language took up about 500 megabytes because the globe itself was composed of tiles with the country names all carefully hand painted onto those tiles. And for each language we had to have a new set of tiles, of course. Okay? It's a really tricky problem. We had to engineer a solution which basically allowed us to draw the names on the tiles on the fly and be able to change languages instantly within the app so that we could add new languages without increasing the size of the app. So we threw this out to our engineering team, and they very cleverly came up with a solution which actually allowed us to shave about 800 megabytes off the app and still add in 3 or 4 languages. And we can add another language, and another language, and another language, and it really doesn't take up much space. That's the sort of dedication that you need on your team. Creative teams don't have this "it's good enough" attitude. It's good enough really isn't good enough. Very, very often you hear this. Okay, I've spent all day working on this. I really don't want to spend any more time on it. It's good enough. Okay, and if you have that consistently in your team, you end up with mediocre products. You need people who don't accept this. You need people who are willing to stand up and say, this just isn't good enough, I'm sorry guys. And you need people who will respect those sorts of opinions. It can be tough working on these teams. Here's a good example. We're working on this app. It's Beethoven's 9th Symphony. There's a lot in this app. It's a complex interface design issue. There are a lot of buttons, there's a lot of functionality. And we spent meeting after meeting, design meeting after design meeting, wrestling with this design. This is one particularly bad example that we were wrestling with in the middle. And it's just an example of struggling with too much functionality, and we really had to step back from this, start from scratch and come up with something fresh. You have to be willing to have that discipline to recognize that something isn't good enough, even though you've all put a lot of time and effort into it. And I'll come back to the real world implications of that at the very end. Creative teams also work incredibly hard. The guy who built my stairs worked incredibly hard. He took pride in his work, and I'm afraid digital craftsmanship requires hard work as well. That's just a little summary. I could say a lot more about creative teams, but I feel that these are 4 really important things. But I'll add 2. Creative team is actually no good without inspirational leadership. They need people who will lead from the front, people who will motivate, people who will tell you when it's not good enough, and people also who are willing to hire the very best. You cannot create a creative team without hiring good people. You need to be able to identify them, excite them, and get them to join your team. So that was a bit of theory, but if you don't have that creative team, you might as well forget the rest. That's why it's so important. Let's look at some practical topics. Oh yes, we get this all the time. Many people are under the misconception that software developers and designers essentially inhabit 2 different planets. Yes, that is the case, so do men and women, but actually they get along very well in teams when they like each other, when they appreciate each other, and when they understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. And this is really what we found. Engineering and creative design are equal in TouchPress. We value them both. They're both creative disciplines. Software engineering is a creative discipline. Few people think of it that way. We bring software engineers to our initial design meetings. They meet with our partners. We don't hide them in a back room. And we make sure that our design team and our engineering team work really, really closely together, talk to each other. The engineers, their job is to fulfill the wishes of the designers, to tell the designers what's possible. And very often, if you don't have engineering involved in the early concept stages of the project, you miss opportunities. If we hadn't had engineers involved at the beginning of our Atlas project, we might never have thought about putting this globe interface, because they could tell us it was actually possible. Let me show you some examples. So back to our Disney app. So the home page of an app, this is where I do need the sound. The home page of an app is often an afterthought. It's usually done at the end. There's no time left, there's no budget left. But here we had a real ambition to create a home page which was an experience in its own right, and which conveyed something of the sort of nature of what we were talking about, which had a playfulness with it. And the designer working on the team drew these sketches, waved his arms around and said he wanted this sort of fluid movement of these chapter panels. He wanted to create something like this here that just flowed. Okay, notice the way they're changing in size. Notice the way they go in front of each other and behind each other. Okay. This was actually quite difficult to create. I worked on this one myself, and I know it was a tough engineering challenge to get this right. Okay, we could get it almost there, but to get this really fluid movement, to get the animation of the size change to be just right. And all of this, the purpose of all of this was to create a real world feel, that this was actually a carousel of cards. That's one example. This is another one. So we had this challenge. The story of animation, any animated film, as you all know, goes through a whole series of steps. And the animation gets more and more polished at each step. How do you convey that? Okay. Well, you can just take still drawings and you can show, well, that was what it looked like in its first concept. And then this is what it looked like when it got a little bit more detail. And this is what it looked like at the end. That's fine. Okay, but we wanted to put this together, so we put them into sequences so that you could see the sequence at any stage, and you can change the sequence and see it at any stage. But how do you get a feel for how these fit together? Well, it's really quite simple. You just design it so that you can flick between the stages like that there. So if I move my finger from side to side, I'm scrubbing the movie. If I move my finger up and down, I'm going through the different stages.
We have to clap again.
If I move my... This is... No, that's okay. No, that's okay. Thanks. Yeah. This is another example of something that was easy to throw out as an idea, but quite difficult to execute. And it took a lot of toing and froing, a lot of thinking about to get it just right. The important point was to make sure that the idea had legs, that if we actually got this right, it would be really, really good. Therefore, it was worth investing in. Some wild ideas, they're not worth investing in. Sweat the detail. This is really, really important. If we're working with other partners who have particular appreciations of their content, like musicians, for example, then we need to appreciate what's important to them. And even though it might seem very pedantic to us, because it's important to them, it's important to us. Here's an example. This is one of our literary apps, Shakespeare's Sonnets. And we have academic notes as part of the app. So for example, if I touch the words summer's distillation, a note appears at the side. And we knew that in order for this to have respect from academic institutions, people working, that the format of these notes had to be very specific and absolutely just right. Otherwise, they would simply immediately dismiss the whole concept. And we worked hard to get this. Okay, it seems like a simple example, but it's one where it would have been very easy for us just to have done a quick job. Here's another important point, and something I'd like to throw out to you as well. There's a real danger, we find, of categorizing apps, categorizing books into particular age categories. and Apple haven't helped by creating their kids category and making really narrow ages in that. We like to create apps that work for children of all ages, because I think there's a bit of a child in all of us. Natural curiosity is important. Okay, all of us have natural curiosity from when we're 2 to when we're 80. Playfulness is important. All of us like playful apps. The content isn't dumbed down. It's explained in an interesting and engaging way. And finally, one of the most important things is this layered detail. Let me explain what I mean. Here's our app, The Elements. This was the very first app that we produced. Okay, I just want to draw your attention to some very simple things here. Let me just zoom in a little bit. This is the text. Don't know if you can read it, but the writing is magical, it's sparkling. Okay, an 8-year-old could enjoy this. An 80-year-old would also enjoy it because it's written in a way that isn't specific to a particular age. It's a difficult writing style to get right, and we happen to have people who are very talented at this. Here's an interesting example, again in our Disney animated title. This is called Elsa's Snow, and the purpose here is to demonstrate that snow effects can be created algorithmically. So you can just swipe your finger across the screen and it creates magic dust. Okay. We actually got the algorithm from Disney that they use in their CG animations, and we created a simpler form of that. It was quite a difficult engineering exercise as well. But 2-year-old can enjoy this. No problem at all. 2-year-old will enjoy it. Okay. But we've also added buttons at the bottom which allow you to actually understand what's going on here, which explain the physics. So there's a real physics engine here that we're using, and show how the effects are actually created. If you're an adult or a teenager and really want to understand what's going on here, there's a detailed explanation. So here we've got a feature in an app which a 2-year-old can understand and which an adult can appreciate as well, and everything in between. So we need to think about creating apps that appeal to children of all ages. I did want to touch on app tools. People ask me this very often: what tools should I use to create apps? And there's a whole host of tools that you can use. Many of them are app development environments. They are cross-development environments. They allow you to write apps when you don't have engineers on your team, and all have got their purposes. But overwhelmingly, and I look at these periodically from time to time because I want to make sure I haven't missed the obvious, but no, overwhelmingly our answer is go native. Develop on the native platform. So if you're developing in Android, you need to be developing in Java or C++ using the native Android SDK. If you're developing in iOS, you need to be working in a C++ or Objective-C using Apple's SDK. It's harder. Why? Okay, why should I make it harder for myself when I can just get an app development environment and lash it out quickly? Well, the reason is that nothing stands between your creative team and what's actually possible on that platform. Nothing. If you have to have this layer in the middle, then you are automatically constrained by whatever constraints the team that developed that application environment choose to impose, whatever bugs they choose to introduce or introduce by accident. You can't get past that. You can't extract the optimal performance. The children's app is a really good example, the children's Atlas app. Okay, we could easily have used Unity 3D to do that. Unity 3D is a fantastic environment. We would not have got the performance that we managed to get out of these devices using Unity 3D. Okay, that's quite a strong statement to make because it's a really good platform. And it's because we had to work right down at the detailed OpenGL level, profiling it, optimizing it to get that smooth performance. We needed a 3D engineer who could work at that level. Polish. When the craftsman was working on my stairs, the last thing he did, and he spent nearly a day doing it, was polishing it. Okay? I don't mean he actually polishing it, where he did that at the end, but he went over it and he tidied up lots of little loose ends, okay, and just, it really took a craftsman-like approach to making sure that what he presented to me as the finished goods at the end were as good as he possibly could make it. And that's, again, the approach we need to take in digital craftsmanship. We need to think about how we can make these just that little bit better than they currently are before we release them. And we call this polish. And we make sure that we build the concept of polish into schedules, into budgeting, so that it is possible. Polish really is what you do when you've done everything that you plan to do and you have some time left. Okay? And it's a really difficult discipline to make sure you actually have that time. Appcraft in the real world. So a lot of you might be thinking, well, that's all fine and well, but you know, how do I work with schedules? How do I work with limited budgets? I have to say, it's tough. Okay, it's tough to do this sort of creative work at the sort of level that we aspire to work to, and stick to budgets and stick to schedules. We haven't always got it right, but we're getting better at it. And I think one of the things I would suggest is that very often there's a tendency to leave a little sliver of what we call contingency if something goes wrong. And then we carefully budget everything and then add that little sliver on top. And my suggestion is that sliver needs to be a chunk. And it needs to be in the region of about 30% of your budget, which is unallocated. Because you're going to need that for iteration, you're going to need it for polish, and you're going to need it to do the things which never even occurred to you when you were designing the spec. This is why the spec is important, don't let me underemphasize it, but it needs to be sort of outline spec. It needs to set out the ambition, not all the detail. The details will begin to emerge through the design process. And what you really don't want to do is constrain yourself by the spec before you've even had a chance to immerse yourself in what you're actually doing. So by leaving that contingency both in your budget and also in your schedules. We've just finished an app called Incredible Numbers, and it's all about recreational maths with Ian Stewart, who's a well-known maths author. And I think it's probably the first app where we budgeted it right, we scheduled it right, we had enough time for polish, and what we submitted to the App Store is pretty close to the ambition that we had for the app from the very beginning. And the team is really proud of that. They're proud not just that we created something creative, but that we did it within our budgets and within our schedule. I'm nearly done. So, Appcraft, in summary, even better things happen when you bring creative teams from different disciplines together. So if you imagine the culinary craft, okay, many of the most interesting dishes come from bringing teams together from different culinary disciplines, bringing Asian food and Italian food together. And so the fusion of creative teams, this is something that we've experienced, of bringing our creative team and the creative team from our partners together. Okay, both teams, really powerful, strong teams working together. That's the end.